G'day Internet, welcome back to another video, and one that is a little special. If you're watching this on the day that I release it, it will be this tiny little channel's 5th birthday. Yes, it has been 5 years that I've been sitting here on my own talking to a camera, and the channel's come quite a long way since then. Ever since I uploaded this monstrosity of a thing, please don't go watch it. It's terrible, and annoyingly, it's actually still my most viewed video. But in this particular one, it's something a little different. Most people know that I work at the University of Canberra, and every now and again I do a lecture to our first year IT students on the history of the home computer. Now, there is a very old video of this. We shot it about 4 years ago. I'll put a link up there. But just recently we decided to grab some cameras because I was due to do it again, and we gave it a new recording. Now, for the computer history experts out there, please understand that not only am I kind of trying to convey this to a bunch of like 18 and 19-year-olds, but I'm also trying to squeeze like 40-something years into about 30 or 40 minutes. So some of the details are quite kind of mashed together. Obviously, I can't talk about every single thing and every single detail in such a short space of time. But regardless, I hope you enjoy it, and here it is. Hi, my name's Jason Webber. I'm the IT manager for the Faculty of Science and Technology. And during my day, if I'm not running around behind people like Raoul trying to make things work, I have a bad habit of picking up vintage computers and then repairing them and all that kind of stuff. Now, the reason I'm giving this lecture, you might kind of think, well, this is all modern IT, what are you doing with all this stuff? Both Raoul and I think it's actually important to at least have an idea of where all the stuff you guys are studying has come from. So that's the kind of reasoning behind it. First, some excuses. I'm not an academic. I'm a professional staff member. I give a lecture once in a blue moon, so if I completely screw this up, I apologise. Now, this isn't like some fully referenced academic paper kind of thing. Think of this more as a bit of a story. I hope to try and make it at least somewhat entertaining, because I know for the last hour Raoul's had to go through all the boring bits on how to use Canvas and stuff like that, so maybe this will wake you up a little. And like I said, primarily this is my hobby. Right. In the beginning there was nothing. I know that sounds really ominous, but if we were to go back 40 and a bit years, computers literally just didn't exist in the home, right? We didn't have them in the early 70s and mid-70s. You were lucky to have a television. Well, a colour television, at least. Computers were the realm of big business and universities and things like that. Big, mining corporations and big financial institutes, and like universities and things like that. They didn't really exist. People didn't have them. One highlight I do want to make from back in the day was that some of the earliest pioneers of computing were actually women. And over the last 5 years that I've been giving this lecture, I have actually noticed more and more women kind of in the audience, which is actually fairly fantastic to see. But going back a step, during this time, there were computers, so to speak, but they were the realm of like the hobbyist or the electronics engineer and stuff like that. And they looked like, well, like these. They were single board computers. They probably had a really simple processor. And from an input point of view, you had things like just a small segmented display and buttons from a calculator. That was pretty much it. This was the closest thing you got to home computing in the early to mid 70s. That's probably the most famous one, the Apple I, right? Steve Wozniak designed this in his universities days. They had a computer club where they were literally building and designing these computers from scratch. So that's probably the most famous one. But in 1977, so we're going back a long way, I realise, things changed. There were 3 computers that were released in 1977 across the course of the year. They were the original Apple II, the TRS-80 Model 1 and the Commodore PET. And I've got some examples here. This here is a Commodore PET. I love this machine. I don't know why. I just love the form factor and the way it looks. And some of it's plastic, but a lot of it's like big metal chunky thing. This thing weighs a ton. But there's also the TRS-80 Model 1. That's it. That's your entire computer. That's not just a keyboard, by the way. That's a computer. Don't worry, they get smaller. And over here, we have a fairly early Apple II. Again, this is your computer. All these have been restored and fixed, and yes, they all do run, sorry. The difference between these machines versus the previous ones like these, right? These you had to build yourself, right? So you had to know how to solder, you need to know how to debug the hardware, you were programming it at the hardware level, so on and so forth. These guys were different. These are machines that anyone could rock down to the local shop, buy a computer complete, some software perhaps, take it home, plug it in and start using it. Now, that might sound all a bit foreign or strange to you guys, but that was a massive leap when it comes to computing, okay? You didn't have to be someone who intimately knew the hardware to actually get anything out of it. You could rock down to, you know, Radio Shack or the local computer store, buy one of these, take them home and start using it. The software at the time generally came on either disc or audio cassette. So, okay, do we remember cassettes? Good, right. So yes, we used to load our programs from audio cassette. That's the way we did it. So this made computing so much more accessible to the average Joe in the street, okay? And it was a massive change. But things moved really quickly, especially during the 80s. Okay, so I'm just going to give some examples here, right? Commodore very quickly moved on from the PET. A couple of reasons. It was expensive. You can see there's a lot to it, right? And they really wanted to target the home market. These things kind of got used, they got used a lot in education. So schools would go and buy like a lab of these. But we've got some examples of what they released in the early 80s. So we've got the VIC-20 and we've got the Commodore 64. Now, I'm hoping, because I'm going to feel really old if you don't, who has at least heard of the Commodore 64? Yeah, kind of, right. This is the Commodore 64 here, okay? This was, without a doubt, the biggest selling computer throughout the 80s. Something ridiculous, like 17 million of these got sold, right? And they were everywhere. What this brought to the home was a dedicated sound chip and a dedicated graphics chip, okay? So if you think about that in the modern context, right, that kind of thing was happening here, right? And this thing was, like, don't get me wrong, it got used for a whole bunch of other things, but this thing was just a gaming behemoth, right? There are so many games for this, but that's not the first time Commodore would actually do that. So possibly one of the most iconic computers ever made. So that was going on, but Tandy was still kind of in the game after the TRS-80 Model 1. There was the Model 3 and the 4. The Model 2 was a whole different beast. But they saw this explosion in the home market. Now, the TRS-80 kind of ended up as a bit of a boring business computer because it didn't really have much in the way of graphics or sound or anything like that. So they released the colour computer, the Tandy colour computer, also known as the Coco. And there was actually a cousin of the Coco, I'm pointing the wrong way because I'm looking at the screen, that was actually released in Wales, in the UK, called the Dragon 32. Very, very similar computers. Atari entered the market. I think we know Atari, yes, and I also realise that the brand name is a bit of a joke at the moment. So 79, they released the 800, which was followed by a couple of generations of that, which went through most of the 80s. Very popular computer, not as popular as the Commodore 64, but like a lot of the computers that I'm going to show you today, there's actually still huge community support for these machines 40 years later, which I know is strange and it sounds incredibly nerdy or geeky or whatever, but well, I think it's cool. So the Brits saw this, and what happened in Britain was interesting. The government decided that if they didn't lift the literacy of computers in general across the nation, Britain as a country, or England as a, the UK was going to get left behind, okay? Because they saw this as a real opportunity to move forward, the whole country forward in a different direction. Because you've got to remember, at the time, most of their industry was dying in a ditch, car manufacturing had fell over, mines were being closed, and they thought this is a way forward. So the BBC decided they're going to put together what's called the Computer Literacy Program. And what it was a nationwide program to target mainly primary school kids. The downside of it is they needed a standardised platform to teach this. So they went out to market and asked for tenders on various computer manufacturers to provide a computer that would do this. The winner was a computer called the BBC Micro, which is this guy here. It's a bit of a beast. I'm told the plastic is made out of the same stuff that like police bulletproof vest stuff used to be made out of on the time. What made this incredibly useful, not just in education, was the 1,000,001 I/O ports that were actually buried underneath. Because you look on the back and you just kind of think, well, there's not much going on. There's a whole stack of stuff going on underneath. So you've got disk drive ports and all that kind of printer ports and all the rest of it. But one of the most interesting one, and it's just here, it's called the Tube, which is an unusual name, and we'll get back to that, why it's important a little later on. But the short version is that it enabled you to plug a whole second processor into the machine, so you could basically have a co-processor, which isn't bad for like 1981. But that machine was actually kind of expensive. It was about the £350 mark. Now, you need to put that in perspective. So that's 1981, right? I don't know what it is in today's dollars, but it's a lot more. You also have to realise that at the time, the UK was broke, okay? The average person couldn't afford to drop the better part of £400 on a home computer. So Clive Sinclair of Sinclair Computers, he's now Clive, well, he was Clive, Sir Clive Sinclair, he passed away recently. He thought, well, let's create a computer that's cheap, right? That the home computer market will actually buy. And they came up, there was a couple of precursors to this, but they came up with this. This is the Sinclair ZX Spectrum, that one, right? You know how I was saying before with the TRS-80, that's your entire computer? That's your entire computer, that. In 1980, whenever it was, 2. Okay, inside this is memory, a processor, and a chip called the ULA, which kind of did, well, everything else. They're actually a bit of a flaky chip that has a bad habit of dying. But these are about 120 pounds, right? This actually put it into the hands of the average person in the street. And this actually had a major, major effect. This particular one that I'm holding in my hand is actually a little special. I'm just going to take a little side tangent here for a minute. Last week, I got a link to a Gumtree ad from a mate of mine. Now, anyone who collects anything, right, I don't care if it's pops or postage stamps, right, you're always on the lookout, right, for something cool or something different. So I got a link to this Gumtree ad. It was through a completely different computer. Called the guy up, David his name was, and I said, so this computer, I'll take it, when can I come pick it up? He goes, oh, this afternoon, I've got this other one, it's a ZX Spectrum as well. Are you interested in that? I went, yeah, okay. He said, I might not be around, but here's the phone number of my wife, Ruth. Give her a call if no one answers the door. I rock up about 4 o'clock in the afternoon or so. Ruth answers the door. He starts showing me the computers and stuff like that. And we got talking. I mentioned, oh, I work at UC. I've been there a while. And she went, oh, I used to work at UC. So Ruth actually turns out to be Dr. Ruth Foxwell, who held many senior positions, including what was the equivalent to the dean of this faculty 20 odd years ago, right? Who had this amazing career and did all these wonderful things here at UC, went on to then have an amazing career with the World Health Organization and all this stuff. And I'm just like, I just randomly walked into this person's house. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't actually find a photo of Ruth. So that's a selfie that I took when I was there. That's Ruth. She's now happily retired and enjoying life. So that's a little side story. Now, Australia wasn't to be completely left behind. I'm going to do a bit of a local tangent here. Now, I also need to put this into a bit of context. At the end of the day, Australia is a small market, okay? And especially back in the 80s, before internet and all the rest of it, also very isolated, okay? But one of the real pioneers, I guess you could call it, of computers in the home was Dick Smith of Dick Smith Electronics. Now, you've got to realise this is back when Dick Smith Electronics was, well, actually an electronics store and not just a brand of Kogan. And so they imported, now this one wasn't actually manufactured in Australia, but it's one of those computers we kind of claim as our own. This is the Dick Smith System 80. It was a TRS-80 clone. You've got your cassette deck all built in, and everything's kind of in there ready to rock and roll. The reason I mentioned this is actually my family's first computer, not this particular one. But when I was about 3 years old, so it would have been maybe 4 years old, about 82-ish. This was my family's first computer, was one of these, and this is what my first experience with computing was, one of these, so hence why it's kind of special to me. But there was a very successful computer that we did actually produce here in Australia. And in reality, it's the only Australian mass-produced computer. There's been others, but not at the scale of the Micro B. And that's this little guy here. This started life as a kit computer, and it was so popular they decided to actually put it into manufacture. They won a tender with the New South Wales Department of Education, so you would find these in schools everywhere throughout the 80s. When I moved town in year 4 and I started at Nowra Primary, yes, I'm from Nowra, sorry, we had a lab of these, and this is essentially my first school computer. They're cool. They've got basic graphics and sound, and they actually run an old operating system called CPM. Little tangent, BMW Australia set up a nationwide network of these things to manage their spare parts database, which is kind of cool. Sweden imported a whole stack of them for their schools. Sorry, I just find that a little random. So yes, and they made accessories like disk drives and all the rest of it, and I have some of those. I just don't have the trolley space to bring them over. We then, towards the end of the 80s, there's another big shift in computing, right? So all of these computers that I've talked about so far use what's called an 8-bit processor, okay? You know how most processors these days are usually 64-bit, some 32-bit, kind of get where I'm going, like you run a 64-bit version of Windows or Linux or whatever it happens to be, right? So before that, there was 16-bit, and before that was 8-bit. So it didn't take long for computer developers to essentially go, well, 8-bit's good, 16 bits has got to be better, right? And they did. The two main ones that I'm going to bring up, there are others, is the Atari ST, which I, ran out of trolley space for. Quickly on the Atari ST, it came with 2 MIDI ports actually built in as standard. If anyone's into music production or whatever, you'll know what MIDI ports are. Are they still used? Is MIDI still used? Got a few nods, right? You would find these in recording studios and people doing audio mixing and stuff like that all over the place. Running Cubase, I think the name of the program was. Is that another one, is it? Okay. The Amiga, okay, hands up who's heard of the Amiga. God, there's less. We're getting newer. I should be getting more hands. Right. So the Commodore 64 was still on sale and it kind of became their budget model. But Commodore then came out with the Amiga. Now, the beauty of the Amiga is they kind of took the idea of the Commodore 64 with dedicated graphics hardware and sound hardware and things like that and improved it drastically, don't get me wrong, and teamed it up with a Motorola 68000 processor, the same as this one. But when they launched it, they launched the original one was the Amiga 1000. And as famous as the Commodore Amiga was, the 1000 was actually not a success. And the reason is this, is because it was expensive, okay? But it wasn't taken seriously enough for the business community, and it was too expensive from home. It's a wonderful machine, I've got one, but it kind of found itself stuck in this kind of middle ground between the two markets. So about 12 months after that, they split the computer and they released the 500 and the 2000. The 2000, which is their professional model, went on to successive models, and it really found its home in television production. It had the ability to basically grab video, overlay graphics or whatever, and then spit it out for broadcast. So as an example, you're all too young for this, but if you were ever watching the cricket in like the late 80s and the 90s and they have like the graphics that come up, whatever, right? There's a pretty decent chance that was actually done with a professional level Amiga. But the 500 went on to be a massive success, not necessarily in the home market of the US, but in Australia, in Europe, in the UK, and that's this guy here. Again, you know how I was saying before that this was just like this game's behemoth? It had nothing on this guy. The number of games and software still being produced today, like there's hobbyists out there still writing programs for the Commodore 64 as well for this. And this was the real big step up, because with this you've got a proper graphical user interface, so you weren't just hammering commands at a basic prompt. And this really brought that sense of this is a real computer into the home. And people started really kind of using it for, their homework, homework. Mom, I want a computer to do my homework. And so this was huge, and still incredibly popular today throughout the retro computer community. Apple weren't to be left behind. In '83, they released this, the Lisa. It was a flop. It was ridiculously expensive and slow as a wet week. It just didn't have the grunt. Because they introduced this with the graphical user interface that the Macintosh was always famous for, but it just didn't have the hardware to back it up. It was also $10,000. It was that or a new car.
Needless to say, it didn't sell that great. So a year later, they went, oh, that didn't work. And they released what we now know as the Macintosh. I've got one here. This is a slightly later one. This is the Macintosh Plus, because the original only had 128K of RAM, a bit like the Lisa, couldn't get itself out of bed. But this one actually came with a meg of RAM, and you could actually use it. And even to this day, like if you were to go up to the marketing department and you see 2/3 of the computers up there are Mac, because these really found their home in desktop publishing, because they had a really nice, sharp, high-resolution screen, and the programs that were written for it were really that whole, we take what you see as what you get editing just for granted now. You know, like highlight a bit of text, make it bold, make it italic, all that kind of stuff. That really didn't exist. I mean, you could do it kind of on the Amiga, but not at that professional level like the Mac did. And that's actually from this machine onwards, that's where the Mac really, really put its foot in the door when it comes to desktop publishing and well, any kind of publishing. So that's the story behind the Mac. Tandy, as I said, they went on through the 90s. They eventually ditched their proprietary hardware like the TRS-80 and the Coco, and they basically just started making IBM clones. But speaking of, IBM is actually not a name I've mentioned. We'll go back a few steps. 1977, big explosion, people getting computers, blah, 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 right? IBM, which is at the time especially, was a behemoth of a company, basically just sat back. And they just went, right, we just want to see where this is going before we commit anything. IBM's problem, though, was their internal processes for research and development and all the rest of it would basically, like, it'd take them 18 months just to decide what screws would go into a computer, okay, let alone the actual hardware. So they broke their own rules, put together a small team to develop a desktop computer. It was still business orientated, but a desktop computer. It didn't dominate the home market, but this is basically here, this is the birth of most of the computers that you have, sorry Apple people, not you, most of the PCs at least that you have, because obviously it started with MS-DOS, which moved into Windows, so on and so forth. Intel x86 architecture, all started here. Quick side note, that keyboard, it's called a Model F keyboard. You'll actually these days pay more for that keyboard than you will for the rest of the computer. Keyboard nerds love them because they're the most mechanical. You know, everyone goes and buys gaming mechanical keyboards, right? Pfft, you ain't got nothing on this. This is like the best keyboard known to man. I don't care what you say. But going into the 90s, for a few of these companies, everything started to go horribly wrong. Okay, so Commodore, for instance, had come along with Amiga, and in 1985, it set the world on fire. But the problem is they didn't continue to develop that platform. And so by the early 90s, everyone else had kind of caught up. Even the IBM PCs had caught up with like Super VGA graphics and Sound Blaster sound cards and all this kind of stuff. And they kind of took what in reality was pathetic little half steps with things like the Amiga 1200 and their budget Amiga 600 and things like that. And this is a company that basically started the home computer revolution, okay? By 1994, they'd filed for bankruptcy and they were gone. That was the end of the company because they just didn't reinvest back into their research and development. There's a lesson for you. If any of you end up being CEO of some tech company, just saying, don't forget about your R&D, otherwise we'll start referring back to Commodore. Apple weren't going great either. You probably know the story of kind of the late 80s. Steve Jobs got the boot from the company. They went through a bunch of different CEOs. They had no direction. They were kind of just doing random stuff all over the place. And throughout the 90s, they ended up with this kind of range of computers that all roughly looked the same, and they practically kind of operated the same, but there was something ridiculous like 25 models in their range. And what essentially was happening was people would walk into an Apple store and go, sell me a computer, and they'd go, well, you've got 25 to choose from, here's the brochures. And they'd go, that's just too difficult, I'm just going to go buy a PC. And they just lost sways of the market. One of the first things that Jobs did was actually to cull 70% of their range, because he's just like, these are all the same, why are we doing this? It's just confusing people. But it wasn't all bad. Now, don't get me wrong, Apple came literally a hair from bankruptcy. All right, so I'm sorry, but your nice little Apple PowerBook or whatever it is just there wouldn't exist had that kept going. Your iPhones, your iPads, nothing, right? There's two things that saved Apple in the late 90s. One was actually a bailout from Microsoft, of all people. They did two things. They basically bailed out Apple for about the tune of about $150 million, and they started developing their Office suite for Mac, because it didn't previously exist. They had Internet Explorer, but it didn't previously exist for Apple. What that essentially enabled is it basically enabled Apple to become relevant again, because by that stage, Microsoft Office had just become the standard, just like it is today. You know, I love OpenOffice and all the other alternatives, but let's be honest, it's all about Microsoft Office. The other thing was this. The original iMac G3, this guy here, I'm not going to pick it up because it's heavy. This, it's hard to explain this one. Internally, it's not actually that exciting. It's a Generation 3 PowerPC processor. It came with like, the base model came with a minimum amount of RAM, a bit of a graphics card, and all the rest of it. But just look at it. Okay, imagine you've gone from walking into a shop where every computer looked like this, right, to walk into a shop and seeing this, right? People wanted this, if nothing else, just because it looked cool on their desk, right? And it did away with some things people didn't like it did away with a whole bunch of legacy I/O, and it was purely USB and stuff like that. But people, they couldn't make enough of these when it first launched, because everyone's just like, that's cool, I want one of those. And the influx of money from Microsoft and then the sales generated from this is honestly, hand on heart, what saved Apple and what gave them the money to reinvest into their R&D to produce things like the iPhone, the iPad, things like that. But coming into the 90s, things weren't great for IBM either. The one bit that they had copyrighted, which was the BIOS, okay, which is the tiny little bit of software on the chip that kind of gets everything going, they had copyrighted that. Fortunately, it took engineers about 30 seconds to completely reverse engineer that BIOS, right? And clones started flooding the market, right? And there's nothing, IBM tried to take them to court, failed, because they'd done what's called a clean room reverse engineer of the BIOS, and so IBM's market share kind of went, yay, no, because that whole business market had been taken on by, you know, your Dells, your HPs, your Compaqs and stuff like that. And I can't remember the exact date, it was early 2000s. IBM just gave up and sold their entire desktop and laptop business to Lenovo. So if you ever wonder why you have Lenovo ThinkPads, because they were IBM ThinkPads originally. Because they just went, that's it, there's no money here anymore, we're not going to put any more effort into it. So this is going to sound strange, but bear with me. The reason weird people like me are into this kind of stuff, A, because we appreciate what came before. A lot of us spend some time learning about computers that we may have missed when we were kids, right? My personal computer background was actually really boring. We had the Dick Smith and then we had like a 286 IBM. I missed out on like the Commodore 64 and all that kind of stuff. So I've, now that I'm, you know, middle-aged, God, I hate that. Middle-aged, no kids, bit of expendable income, buy this stuff because I can. But the main thing that so many of us really go back and enjoy is the games. Because at the end of the day, no one remembers the word processor because it's the games that we grew up. And I'm sure it's the same with you lot, with your PS5s and your Xboxes and stuff like that, is that, you're not going to remember, there's a lot of stuff you're not going to remember. Like, you're not going to remember, remember that awesome version of like Microsoft Word that I used back in uni? Very cool. No. So that's one of the reasons why we really enjoy it. So where are we now? Coming out of the 2000s, the 1990s, we basically, a lot of the proprietary stuff had died off and we ended up with PC compatibles, and I hate to say this, Macs. And that's pretty much the way it is even today, is that the bulk of people are still Windows users or Microsoft users on PCs, and the hardcore people that still love their Macs. I'd like to point out that I am bilingual. I do enjoy both platforms just as much as each other. But from kind of the late 90s, early 2000s, things really haven't actually changed that much. There's been gradual evolutions, things have improved and all the rest of it. In reality, the only real big change has been Apple switching to the M1 architecture, right? So that's one major change in like the last 20 years. Yay. Hence another reason why I love all this old stuff, because things were changing so quickly. The other big thing that's changed is this thing called a system on a chip, right? Which is essentially taking your graphics, your RAM, your I/O, your processor and everything and jam it into a single bit of silicon. The most popular of these is obviously the ARM processor, or the ARM architecture, which is what the Apple M1 is based on, and it's what every single one of your phones and tablets uses. It's an ARM-based processor. I don't care if it's a Samsung or an Apple or a Nokia or whatever it happens to be. It uses the ARM architecture as its process. Now, does anybody know what ARM originally stood for? It stood for Acorn RISC machine, RISC meaning reduced instruction set. That Acorn is the same company that made this in 1981. Remember that tube port that I mentioned that said you could plug a second processor into? This is the computer they developed the ARM processor on this, throughout the 80s. This is important, right? This is important to exactly what you guys use today, be it in your shiny new Apple M1, or your phone or your tablet. The architecture was designed by Sophie Wilson, who's just, look up genius in the dictionary and she's listed somewhere there, I'm sure. The other place that it's used is the Raspberry Pi. Okay, I'm sure by now most of you have at least had some experience with a Raspberry Pi, or you at least know what a Raspberry Pi is. Tiny little cheap computer, about 50 bucks, can do all kinds of weird stuff with it. And the Raspberry Pi, this is where we start to come a little bit full circle again. The Raspberry Pi is aimed at the hobbyist, it's aimed at experimentation, and what I call general hackery, right? Let's take a bit of computer hardware and just see what we can do with it, right? And if we go all the way back to, I think it was the third slide, where I showed you those single board kit computers from the early 70s, that's exactly the same thing, okay? It's a whole area of computing that we lost for the better part of 40 years. And it's only now we're starting to go, hang on a minute, we can do more. We're remembering that we can do more with these things than just Excel spreadsheets, and word processing. That's kind of it. My throat's sore. I haven't been able to drink my coffee, which is now cold. Any questions? A normal Intel processor. Okay. So for those following at home, the question is, what are the benefits of ARM over normal x86 or complex instruction set? Then it's actually in the name, reduced instruction set versus complex instruction set. But in the real world benefits, we're talking things like power consumption, heat. These processors sip the electricity, and that's why you've got them in your mobile devices, okay? Yet they're still quite powerful. I mean, it's the reason why Apple have jumped on the ARM bandwagon to run their top-end MacBooks and stuff like that. I normally don't do this, but if you find this interesting, I actually run a little YouTube channel. We'll put the link up on Canvas. I mention this because I'm closing in on 10,000 subscribers. Like, comment, subscribe. But yeah, and so every couple of weeks I'll throw out a video of kind of this, but shorter, me jumping around, getting a sore throat. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
So I hope you watched that all the way to the end. Look, I get a real kind of buzz out of doing that lecture. And well, at the end of it, you saw I actually got like a round of applause from all the students, which I can tell you now doesn't normally happen in a normal kind of uni lecture. And after I finished, all the kids came flooding down to the front and wanted to get a bit of hands-on time with some of the computers. I only had the ability to like power up one, but it was the pet. And showed a bit of, I think it was Space Invaders that I very quickly ran up. And everyone was just like, ooh, that's so awesome. And look, I honestly think all the kids had a ball and I had a blast doing it. So yes, it has been 5 years of doing YouTube. And I would like to take this opportunity to give a bunch of shout outs. So please, for their sake, don't tune out. Please listen to the shout outs and some of the names that I really want to mention. First and foremost, it has to be my patrons who are scrolling up the screen as I speak. I give them a shout out at the end of every video, but hand on heart, their small donation every month just helps so much with the financial burden of running a YouTube channel. I say it often, this stuff ain't cheap, and it really does help just take the edge off that. But it's not just about the money, it's about the support they give me, the comments I get from them directly on my YouTube videos, or messages that I get from them through Discord or Twitter or whatever it happens to be. I do need to give a very special shout out to both Randall, Mark from the Retro channel, and Nathan, who have personally, because they live nearby, have personally helped me out a lot. So an extra special shout out to those guys. Now, I also want to send out some thanks to my fellow YouTubers. Now, here is a list of people that have helped me out over the years, but I do need to make some special mentions. The first and foremost has to be Neil from RMC. Now, if you know Neil at all, you will know that he is the nicest, most helpful guy you have ever met. And Neil has helped me out incredibly, either working out stuff in the back end, pointing me in the right direction on other things, or simply just receiving messages from me just kind of going, this whole YouTube thing is shit and I don't want to do it anymore. Because it happens. And so a massive thank you to Neil. Neil, if you're watching, thank you. Also to Mark from Mark Fixes Things. We all know he's had a pretty rough trot over the last few years, but he's always stayed helpful, open for a chat, whatever it happens to be. And Reese from Control-Alt-Reese. We've done some collabs together. He's always up for something fun, so thank you, Reese. And of course, Adrian from Adrian's Digital Basement. Mr. Black, you are a gentleman and a scholar. He's one of the most knowledgeable people I have ever met, and Adrian and I chat all the time about all kinds of different things, not just YouTube, and he's just one of the nicest guys, easy to get along with, and has always been a massive supporter of the channel. And finally, all you lot, everyone who has watched my videos, subscribed to my channel, left a comment, thank you. As a YouTuber, I tend to, by default, get a little negative about the YouTube comments section, but honestly, hand on heart, 90% of the comments left on my videos are positive or constructive. So thank you everyone who has engaged with me and the channel over the years. But I think that will pretty much do it. If you enjoyed the video, like, subscribe, comment, all the rest of it. If you would like to help support the channel, there is a link to my Patreon down in the description. But until then, I'll see you in the next one.